everyone for coming out. My name is Derek O'Keefe. I'm an editor with Ricochet Media, a longtime activist and journalist, media activist, some combination of those two things here in Vancouver. And it's a pleasure to be organizing our annual or biannual event with David Barsamian. So give a warm welcome to our guest, David Barsamian. It's not really an annual talk, but we've been lucky in recent years that David has passed through the Northwest, and groups here have been able to organize talks because the information that he shares with us and the alternative perspective that many of you listen to on alternative radio is really vital to hear in person, and it's important in these times that we get together and talk about things in person as well as online. So as mentioned, Ricochet Media is the publication that I'm with. We're one of a few sponsors of tonight's event. We also wanted to thank the SFU Institute for the Humanities that generously organizes room bookings here and helps sponsor events from an incredible range of progressive speakers year-round, and they've chipped in again tonight. Also, the South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy, SANSAD, long-standing solidarity and political organization here in Vancouver, helping to sponsor this event tonight and spread the word. And I know they're long-time friends of David, and we are all happy to have him here again. Of course, all events in Vancouver take place on unceded Coast Salish territories, and in Canada, this is whether the territories are covered by treaties that are not being adhered to by the colonial state, or in the case of most of British Columbia, unceded territories like here in Vancouver. I think we all have a responsibility to put that central to all the political work that we do and draw connections between colonialism that takes place within the present borders of Canada and the colonialism and imperialism and related activities that Canadian corporations and Canadian military and government are involved in abroad. Understanding and actually naming imperialism and colonialism is really a matter of knowing our own history. That's why alternative histories and alternative media are so crucial. David has just come back from Turkey and commemorations observing the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide in Turkey, which to this day the Turkish government refuses to actually acknowledge in those terms. And I think he may get into it in his talk, but we can think about the parallels in the ways in which Canada, maybe more subtly at times, less subtly other times, has its own denial of the genocide that has been committed, and the related practices that are ongoing today in the dispossession of Indigenous peoples here in Canada and North America. So I'm going to keep the introduction brief because David says he's going to make like Fidel Castro and give a very, very long speech tonight. I think that's an old joke by now, and we know David will actually stick to about 30-40 minutes because he wants to have time for a Q&A, and we'll have a little under an hour probably for a discussion, so you'll all get a chance to ask questions and make brief comments in the discussion period. What else to say about David? You know his alternative radio. You know many of the books he's written, and many of the important scholars, public intellectuals, and activists he's interviewed over the years, co-publishing books with Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn, Iqbal Ahmed, Tariq Ali, many, many others. David is often the one doing the interviewing, and tonight we're lucky that after his talk, we'll be interviewing him collectively. So please give David Barsamian a warm welcome.
Well, good evening, Vancouver. Ahlan wa sahlan, khush amadid, swagatam, khush geldeniz. It's very nice to see you all here, taking time off from your schedules to hear about media, terrorism, and the Middle East. Special thanks to Derek O'Keefe, who helped put this event together, and my comrade from the US, Scott Chaplin, who has been the tour manager. This is day two of an 8-day tour where I'm giving 7 talks. And so we started in Bellingham yesterday, Vancouver today, Tomorrow we'll be in Victoria, the day after Nanaimo, then Whidbey Island, then 2 events in Seattle, and then hopefully in one piece I'll return to Boulder, Colorado, and still have my head screwed on in the right place. Well, the topic is so enormous that it's actually difficult to find an entry point. But I think, as Derek mentioned in his introduction, I've just recently returned from Turkey, participating in events marking what is called by historians the first genocide of the 20th century. By the late 19th century, particularly in the United States, the Native American population, First Nations, had already pretty much been the victims of genocide. And so the Armenian genocide of 1915 marks a kind of new era in technological genocide, because there was the use of the telegraph and also other transportation, such as introduction of railroads to transport victims from the traditional Armenian homeland in what is called Anatolia to the Syrian desert, and ultimately to their deaths. So this issue is still very much alive today in Turkey. It is criminal under the Turkish Penal Code to even talk about it. And it's not just for Americans, but Turks themselves. None other than Orhan Pamuk, the great novelist who's won the Nobel Prize, was threatened with criminal prosecution by the Turkish state. Other people, another writer, Elif Shafak, she was also threatened and had to leave Turkey. Actually, Pamuk left Turkey. Taner Akjam left Turkey, another historian who has written about this, and many others. But we're breaking through the silence of 100 years, and it requires an enormous effort. It requires not just having historical fact and documentation organized and systematized in a way that's accessible to people, but it's also the persistence of knocking on that door until the door opens. And until now, the state, the Turkish state, has steadfastly denied the reality of the genocide. And so in some ways, this is the final stage of genocide, because the healing is not allowed to occur. It is not possible to have reconciliation unless you have acknowledgement. So the wound is still open. And until there is acknowledgement, it's going to remain open. So I did participate in a number of very moving events with civil society members and NGOs, Turkish and Kurdish, in Istanbul, in Ankara, and in the Lake Van area, which is right near the eastern border of Turkey, near Iran. And one of the poems I wrote a special poem for this occasion, and I'd like to read it to you because it really does intersect with the whole idea of state power, of lying, of propaganda, of distortions of history and fabrications and inventions of the past. You know, and all states have mythologies about who they are. I think Canada must have them. The United States certainly has them, with our, founding fathers who seem to be immaculate and have, never committed any crime in their lives. So cutting through that is, I think, a major task of any public intellectual or any citizen. How do we speak truth to power? So I wrote a poem which is now getting around. It was also performed by the Kronos Quartet a few days ago in Brooklyn, New York, and in Yerevan, Armenia, at the end of April. And it's called "A Century is a Long Time. It is and it isn't." And I think I'm going to have to stop and start and maybe explain a few things that may not be clear. It's important to complete the poems and eat the last pieces of lavash. Lavash is an Armenian flatbread. It's important to finish the last pieces of lavash. Our grandparents are singing. Let's finish their songs. The lost child of an Armenian village cries out, Maidig, Maidig, Ures, Menagem, Gavachnam. Mama, Mama, where are you? I'm all alone. I'm afraid. Those who control the present control the past, and those who control the past control the future. Orwell, 1984. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Santayana, a Spanish philosopher of the 19th century. The struggle of humankind against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. Milan Kundera, the contemporary Czech writer. Who speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? Adolf Hitler, just days before the invasion of Poland. Germany and Austria were allies with Turkey during World War I, and Hitler was very familiar with what happened to the Armenians and thought, well, you know, if the Turks can pull it off, maybe we can do it in Germany with the Jews. The past is never dead. It's not even past. William Faulkner. And so here in Canada, you know, as you deal with your First Nation issues and environmental degradation and racism, the past is never past. It's alive, particularly for Indigenous people who have not severed their connections with Pachamama, with nature, with this terra, with this bhumi, with this zameen, with this land. And if I can say, you know, in the Anglosphere has kind of separated itself. You know, as I was walking down Davie Street today, everyone had their heads in their handheld devices. There was no eye contact, and people were talking, you know, on their phones as well. It's very interesting to see that. I mean, the same thing happens in the US. Canada has no monopoly on this. You go into a cafe, and before people used to be talking to one another, and now they're all looking at their devices, iPads and iMacs, and, you know, buds in their ears. And it's very interesting how we're getting separated, which actually plays right into the hands of power to some extent, because we're not communicating, we're not communing. And community is so important. If you're interested in social change, you know, we're not all Martin Luther King Jr.'s that are great orators and that can attract or generate movements. We're ordinary people, most of us. And so we need to commune with other ordinary people to create organizations like Idle No More, like Black Lives Matter in the United States, and other such civil society organizations. So I went a little away from my poem. A century is a long time. It is and it isn't. Yergir, that's the Armenian word for homeland. Maybe some of you Hindi speakers here know Desh or Vatan in Arabic and Turkish. Homeland, Yergir. Water so clean, air so pure, fruits and vegetables so tasty and delicious. So survivors of the genocide told me, probably with some exaggeration, when I was interviewing them in the 1970s. Yergir, a magical place full of wonder and cruelties. Bedros, my father, was born in 1895 near Palu in central Anatolia during the Hamadian massacres. How many of you know about the Hamadian massacres? Probably none of you. About 200,000 Armenians were killed between 1894 and 1896 by Sultan Hamid II. He was known as Le Sultan Rouge. And that was the prelude to the genocide, which was to follow 20 years later. But in that year, the year my father was born, his father, Barsam, that is to say my grandfather, disappeared never to be seen again. Nobody knows what happened to him. Nobody knows what happened to thousands of people that simply disappeared. My father, Bedros, left Yergir in 1912. 80 years later, he is hit and killed by a car on 87th Street and 1st Avenue in New York. The car was driven by a Turk. When I told my sister what happened, she said in Armenian, Jagad Akir. Jagad is the forehead. It is written on the forehead. He could not escape his destiny, even though he fled Turkey before the genocide. He died right just a few blocks from where I grew up in New York. Turkey, a crime scene. No more Enver and Talat statues and streets. Enver and Talat were the two architects of the genocide. They were the masterminds. And if you go to Turkey today, shockingly, if any of you have traveled there, you'll find Talat parks, Enver universities and colleges named after Enver, boulevards named after Talat. Imagine if we were to go to Germany and we'd be walking along Goering Boulevard or Hitlerstrasse or Goebbels' School of Education. People would be appalled, rightly so. Yet in 2015 in Turkey today, these genocidists, these homicidal maniacs, are being honored by the state. So I'm saying to the Turkish people here, no more pretending it didn't happen. No more macho posturing. Liberate yourselves from twisted and toxic nationalist narratives. Ambassador Morgenthau, he was the American ambassador to Istanbul during this period. He asked Talat, the architect of the genocide, where are the Armenians heading? Talat answers, their destination is the abyss. My mother Araksi remembered in early 1915 there was a plague of locusts in her village north of Diyarbakir. The elders said it was a bad omen. They weren't kidding. The death march. All the men in the draft age men and older, young boys from the age of 15 up to 55 or 60, they were all killed before these death marches started into the Syrian desert. The ground was so hot, my feet were burning, Sakis Hagopian told me. He was one of the people I interviewed. We were so hungry, we ate unripened fruit. We were so thirsty, we wet our parched lips with horse urine, my mother told me. The last time she saw her mother and brothers was in Urfa, which is just north of the Syrian border today. We, the keepers of memories and dreams, keep coming up to remind you and ourselves of the past, a faded but dear landscape drenched in blood. Against the ruin of the world, there is only one defense, the creative act. Let us play again in our gardens and fields and glory in the beauty of the flowers forever. A century is a long time. It is and it isn't. Bari Janapar, it's Armenian for safe travels, bon voyage. Shnoragalem, thank you, merci. So I'm dedicating all of my talks and presentations this year to the Armenian genocide and trying to raise awareness about it in the United States and in Canada as well. Well, let's talk now about the Middle East and propaganda and the media. These things seem to be almost redundant. The media are, the function of the media is to largely propagate propaganda, to spread myths and fabrications about, particularly the intentions of the United States. The global peacekeeper, the exceptional nation, as Barack Obama keeps insisting on calling the Americans, the United States. Large parts of the Middle East today are engulfed in violence. Why? What has happened in Libya? What is happening in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and even further apart to Afghanistan, to Nigeria, to Mali. All of these areas, in one shape or form, are undergoing a tremendous violence and also suffering. What historical factors shape these multiple crises? I think, historically speaking, we need a little context. And one of the things the corporate media never does, at least in the United States, is provide that historical background as to what preceded this, what is the context, what factors were involved in that influence events today. And in the U.S. in particular, it just seems, well, these people are violent. It must be something in their gene pool, or it must be something in their holy book, or they just, people naturally want to kill. There's a lust for blood. There's no background whatsoever as to particularly the imperial interventions of the so-called Western powers. First Britain and France, and more recently, particularly since 1945, the United States. So going back to World War I, the period when the Armenian genocide happened, and there was no possibility really of the world to do anything about it because there was this enormous war going on, the British and the French decide to cut up the Middle East into little provinces of Britain and France, and sign the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916. This is one of the major double crosses in history, because at the same time the British and French were secretly negotiating the fate of the entire Ottoman Turkish territories in the Middle East, that is to say Iraq, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, and other areas. They were also promising to the Arabs that if you rise up and fight the Turks, we will give you independence after the war. So there was a slight contradiction there and an enormous amount of lying. The war ends. The Arabs are immediately double-crossed. The Balfour Declaration is actually signed by Lord Arthur David Balfour in November 2nd, 1917. Why do I remember that date so well? Because every time I saw Edward Said, his birthday was on November 2nd. But that was the day of the catastrophe, or the beginning of the catastrophe for the Palestinian people, when the British minister, Lord Balfour, essentially signed away land that he did not own or control or had any legal claim to a third party. And that became the basis for the legal basis for the Zionist claim on Palestine. The Balfour Declaration was immediately incorporated into the League of Nations Charter. It's constantly referred to, even today, by heads of state in Israel as a founding document for that state, and crucially, as a document of legitimizing Israel's existence. Well, almost right away, when the British and the French moved in, there were revolts, particularly in Iraq. People don't find it pleasurable to be occupied. They don't like to be insulted and humiliated in their own homes, particularly by mostly white Christians who don't speak their language, who have no understanding of their cultures and traditions. They don't find that a pleasant experience. So almost immediately there's a revolt in Iraq, and it was brutally repressed by the British. The British had already identified oil reserves in Iraq as being very valuable, and they intended to get them in the Mosul, Kirkuk area, and also further down near the Gulf, which the British then broke Kuwait off from Iraq, created a straight-out colony, and then occupied the rest of the region. The French were left with pretty much Syria and Lebanon. The British had Iraq and Palestine to control. A revolt breaks out in Iraq. The British suppress it. And this gave way to the Curzon doctrine. Lord Curzon was a very high official in the British Foreign Ministry. I believe he was one of the viceroys in India, as a matter of fact. And he said, what we have to do to control these people, that is to say, the people who live in these countries, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and others, we have to create an Arab facade. So up front, we have to have our chosen emirs and sheikhs and other leaders representing us, and behind them, we are pulling the strings. So that Arab facade became a motif, not just for the British and the French, but later for the Americans as well, as they tried to, move into the Middle East. I'm going to compress a lot of history here. We're going to jump to the end of World War II, 1945, when the U.S. emerges as the global hegemon, the dominant power in the world. And a couple of years before that, in 1943, it was already clear to planners in Washington that how the war was going to end. In the previous year, the Soviet army broke the back of the German Wehrmacht in Stalingrad, and it was very clear that Germany would not win after that. And the US was going to win in the Pacific as well. So Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was the president of the United States at that time, told his State Department planners, I want to see what the post-World War world will look like. Post-War world will look like, draw me up some plans. And they became what is called the Grand Area Strategy. You can access this on the internet if you like to see. I mean, this is the imperialists laying out their desires about how to dominate the world in very bold terms. There's no subterfuge here about human rights or freedom or liberty or democracy. All of these euphemisms that cascade from the mouths of network news anchors in the US and probably in Canada as well. The imperialists always have noble intentions. We want to help people. We want to liberate the women of Afghanistan from the oppression of the Taliban. This was said by George and Laura Bush in 2001. And you might remember when Arundhati Roy was here a couple of years ago. She said, this is the first time we've ever heard in our part of the world that the US military is a feminist organization and cares about women's rights. Quite rightly. Well, and also around this time, the U.S. identifies the oil reserves of Saudi Arabia, I'm quoting here, as a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. And the corollary to that, which was unstated in this Grand Area Strategy document, was, and we're going to get it. We're going to push the British and the French out, and we are going to dominate Saudi Arabia. And 2 years later, on February 12, 1945, a very sick and dying Franklin D. Roosevelt meets with Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the king of Saudi Arabia, on a U.S. destroyer in the Suez Canal. And there the Faustian bargain is struck between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia as a country is a very new nation state. It forms around 1932, I think, as a formal nation state. Otherwise it was kind of divided into regions, the Hejaz and Najaf and other areas controlled by local clans. I don't like to use the colonial word tribes because it is so redolent of colonialism. And so FDR and Ibn Saud strike a deal. The US guarantees the security of the Saudi monarchy in return for what? Human rights, women's liberation, right to divorce, for women to own property? No, none of those things. For the right of US oil corporations to have exclusive access to the Saudi oil fields. And so this is the beginning of what has to be one of the most pernicious and venal political marriages. You know, they always say politics makes strange bedfellows. Well, this is way beyond that. This is lethal. Saudi Arabia, since almost its inception, has been a state run by feudals, homophobes, misogynists, and regimes that have been extremely cavalier when it comes to human rights, and particularly rights of women. I've often said, and I think it's in my book here on Iran, that if an Iranian woman were to go to bed tonight and wake up in Saudi Arabia, if a Saudi woman went to bed tonight in Saudi Arabia and woke up tomorrow in Iran, she'd think she's in heaven. She could divorce, she could get married on her own, she could own property, she could drive a car, she could get educated, she can go to colleges and universities. She won't have a lot of political power. That is a complete, almost a total monopoly of men in Iran. But in many areas, there are many more opportunities for Iranian women compared to Saudi women. I believe 65% of all college and university graduates today are women in Iran. I'm going to be going to Iran in October. I haven't been there in a few years, and I'm really looking forward to that. Well, now the U.S. in 1945 has to organize the world. How are we going to dominate the world? Well, we need allies. So the natural allies are the Anglosphere: Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United Kingdom, which may soon not be so united if Scotland has its way. And in fact, the Americans in one document contemptuously refer to the British as lieutenants, knowing their subordinate role. But this creates this kind of Anglosphere. And George Kennan is a very important figure in U.S. Political history. He's regarded as very humane, liberal, thoughtful, not one of these neocon crazies that see all Muslims as terrorists and want to occupy and bomb as many countries as they possibly can. He was regarded as a very intellectual, reasonable, calm man, and so very highly regarded. But in these secret documents, when they talk among themselves, they reveal everything. When they talk to you, I don't know if it's this way in Canada, in Harper's time, when Harper talks to you, he's saying one thing, and when he's talking to his cabinet or his corporate supporters or his Zionist allies, he's saying something very different. So, there's always this kind of schizophrenic division. And I notice you're having a C-51 bill that is moving through Parliament. We're very familiar with these in the United States. The increasing growth of a surveillance state, the draconian measures being taken in order to spy and control the population, and crucially to marginalize and criminalize dissent. I'm going off a little bit here, but the notion that the Harper government is now trying to pass, also criminalizing any activity around boycott and divestment, is, I think, very, very dangerous. Even in the United States, there is no such proposal. It kind of shows you how over the top things are here in Canada when it comes to Israel. And of course, Benjamin Netanyahu has said on a number of occasions that Israel has no better friend than Canada, and particularly Prime Minister Stephen Harper. So there's a lot of work here. I know there's going to be demonstrations on Saturday around C-51. And when these laws are enacted, when they're passed, they're just the beginning. That's the first, the doors open, they see how wide, how much the population will take, and then there'll be new proposals on those that, well, you can't go to this website. You cannot open this Facebook page. If you do, you'll be in violation of this aspect of the Canadian Criminal Code. So it's a very dangerous moment when states accrue more and more Orwellian surveillance power. So we really have to be on this and not let them get away with it, because they are going to push the envelope. They're going to see, but if you push back, then there may be a possibility to stop this legislation in its tracks. Now, get back to George Kennan. As I said, when they talk among themselves, they're very honest. This is what he said in a secret document, now declassified, of course. We, the United States, have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 5% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. Creating a pattern of relationships. So the Baghdad Pact, NATO, the SEATO alliance, all of these military alliances, a huge expansion of military bases around the world, essentially garrisoning the planet with boots on the ground, with Air Force jets and aircraft carriers and submarines and all the like. And then Kennan goes on to say, we need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization. Actually, they do that in the media. The idealistic slogans are always marshaled to defend whatever intervention or whatever action is going on. You know, whether it's Saudi Arabia, again, bombing Yemen, a clear violation of Yemen's sovereignty, certainly with the approval of the United States, or again, Saudi Arabia sending its troops into Bahrain, which is a Shia majority country ruled by a Sunni emir who was facing a revolt during the Arab uprisings in the spring of 2011, and called on his Saudi allies to cross the border and put down the revolt. A blatant, grotesque, unambiguous example of violation of international law and the sovereignty of a state. Did the US or Canada, I don't know if Harper said anything, probably not. The US said nothing about this because this will come as a shock to you, a double standard when it comes to international law. There's one set of rules for the master and the master's servants, and then there's another set of rules for everybody else. So Iran has to be singled out for being targeted for scrutiny because it is trying to develop peaceful uses of nuclear energy. It is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Look at the irony of this. 3 states which have weapons can deploy them, have ballistic missiles to deliver those weapons. I mean, Iran is nowhere near that stage. Israel, Pakistan, and India, all allies of the United States, you know, Shoile Boile, more or less, más o menos, they have a get-out-of-jail pass. I mean, this shows you how, at least in the United States, there's this remarkable propaganda system that doesn't point this out to the American people. That there are 3 states that have weapons, that are not signatories, that are not being scrutinized, they're not being looked at for violations of international law. In the US, 6 corporations control basically what most people see, hear, and read. You know, the important stuff, for example, right now there's a big scandal around American football, you know, whether the footballs were deflated or inflated, and this was a lead story. This wasn't buried in the back pages. This was front page New York Times, our best newspaper. Front page, all the network news programs led with this story. You know, did the New England Patriots cheat? What should the punishment of Tom Brady be, the quarterback of this team? And then there would be a big discussion about that. Oh, he should go to jail. No, they should just fine him. Or he should be suspended for a couple of days. The National Football League, which controls these 32 teams, issued a 243-page report on this particular issue. Do you know when the United States invaded and wrecked Iraq, there wasn't a single report on that? Or when it invaded Afghanistan, or when it's bombing Yemen or Somalia or Libya, you name the countries down the list. No reports. But when it comes to sports, or may I say, the Kardashians, the American media, whoa, every little thing. Oh, she's wearing her hair this way. No, she moved it that way. Now she got a hip replacement. No, it got a breast enhancement. Oh, now her upper lip has been raised. The Kardashians get wall-to-wall, 24/7 coverage. And we're left in the dark. That's why I call the media in the U.S., probably in Canada. Actually, the media are worse in Canada than in the United States. I mean, the bar is very high here. But in Canada, you have 4 corporations that control basically what people see, hear, and read, right? Bell, Rogers, Shaw, and QMI. In the U.S., there are 6, so slightly better. But these weapons and these so-called journalists, are really practicing prostitution. They are prostitutes. They are selling themselves to their corporate masters to produce fluff, to produce, this kind of obfuscations and creating false enemies and manufacturing consent. We need more and more weapons because we're surrounded by enemies. Yes, we're surrounded by enemies because the policy is creating more and more enemies. Whoa, wake up, wake up. But that discussion doesn't go on in the world's second largest democracy. India is the world's largest democracy. And as I told our comrade here earlier today in a radio interview, I've been banned again for the second time to travel to India because I talk about Kashmir and the other revolts that are going on in that country. I guess as you look at me, I'm a very intimidating figure, almost 70 years old, and so the Indian government really should be afraid of me. I really look like a tough guy. So you can understand why they have to reject my visa applications. But that, speaks to the larger issue of censorship, of state control of information, of more and more websites being shut down, of more and more repression. I mean, I talked about Turkey earlier. It's just one of many countries, but Turkey is considered by the Committee for the Protection of Journalists one of the most dangerous countries for a journalist to work in. So we have a system of propaganda, particularly related to the Middle East. Why the focus so much on the Middle East? Obviously, because of oil and the command of oil. In fact, it was again George Kennan, that State Department diplomat, who said, anyone who controls Middle Eastern oil exercises, and I'm quoting here, veto power over the rest of the world. And so, again, it was seen as just this tremendous source of strategic power, and that the U.S. corporations had to control them. I mean, here and there, you allowed the British to have their little concession in Iran, but even there, the U.S. pushed the British out of Iran in 1953, when that country's fledgling democracy under Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown in Operation Ajax, a CIA coup. Now, September 11th, which is a date I think you may have heard of, we are reminded of it constantly in the United States. It is beaten into our brains every time we say or we object to government wiretapping of their capturing of our text messages or emails or these kinds of things. The state says 9/11. You want another 9/11? You want another terrorist attack?
We'll give you another one.
We'll give you another. So this is used as a bludgeon to silence dissent. Now, there's kind of a couple of interesting things to say about 9/11. First of all, it wasn't the only 9/11. But when you're America, when you're the United States, you're the only game on the block. You're the only kid on the block. You're the only one who has ever suffered. Other people have not suffered the way US people have suffered, particularly on that day. Well, in Chile, 9/11, September 11th, has a different resonance. It speaks to the destruction of democracy in that country, the overthrow of a democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende, the killing of thousands of Chilean activists, labor union organizers, etc., communist, socialist, gays, and the imposition of a cruel military dictatorship. So that was another 9/11. Go back a little further to 1906, to the Imperial Theater in Johannesburg. Mahatma Gandhi organized his first satyagraha, his first act of civil disobedience against the British Empire. So there are other 9/11s that get buried because of the propaganda system, and it's always the US suffering that has to be highlighted, so that enables and gives permission for more intervention, for more evisceration of our civil liberties. As my good friend and political radical Michael Parenti says, it's not what they're doing to fight terrorism, it's what they're doing in the name of terrorism, undermining our civil liberties, taking away our rights, all in the name of fighting this amorphous thing called terrorism. Terrorism itself is a very problematic word. It is a tactic. You really can't have war on a tactic. It's like having a war on dandruff or old age or something like that. But what are the causes? What's the background that generates these kinds of things that are called generically terrorism? By the way, again, in the US context, I don't think it's any different here in Canada, it is always the terrorism of what they do to us, not what we do to them. What we do to them is retaliation, self-defense, and that kind of thing. So there's a constant propaganda barrage about this. And also there are what Chomsky calls worthy victims and unworthy victims. So let me just give you a very quick example around Pakistan. You all know about Malala Yousafzai, right? This teenage Pakistani girl, very courageous, wants to have education for Pakistani girls in the northwest frontier area bordering Afghanistan. She's attacked by the Taliban, almost killed, evacuated to England, receives incredible medical treatment, recovers, goes to the UN, is invited by Ban Ki-moon to address the United Nations, wins the Nobel Peace Prize, and then she has an audience with the Emperor and the Empress, Barack Obama and Michelle, and the two daughters were there as well. And I was very interested to see the White House press release the next day about this meeting with Malala Yousafzai, because something was crucially omitted. The White House press release said, well, they talked about education and women's rights and how important it was, and everyone can be very virtuous and cheer on those kind of sentiments. Nothing wrong with that. But then Malala issued her own press release afterwards, saying that I expressed my concerns and worries to President Obama that the drone attacks was fueling terrorism. Fueling. Innocent victims, these are direct quotes, innocent victims are killed in these acts and they lead to resentment among the Pakistani people. So that was buried, not reported, not part of the official record. Now, she is a worthy victim. She got attention because she was the victim of designated enemies, right? We all hate the Taliban. They're awful. But what about Nabila Rehman? Who has heard of Nabila Rehman? A young Pakistani girl whose family was blown to pieces during a US drone strike. She wasn't given a Nobel Peace Prize. She wasn't invited to Washington, D.C. to meet with the president or the first lady. She wasn't invited to the United Nations. She is a non-person because she is a victim of U.S. violence, and that cannot be in any way highlighted. So worthy and unworthy victims. There's a great teaching story in City of God by St. Augustine. I don't usually like to quote Catholic saints, but sometimes they've said good things, maybe by accident. It's called Pirates and Emperors, right? And so there's this pirate on the open seas, and the Emperor Alexander, stops the pirate and says, what are you doing? This is my area of control. And the pirate says, hey, I'm just trying to feed my family, being a pirate, just doing a few things. And Alexander erupts in rage and says, how dare you, I'm the master of the universe. And then the pirate says, yes, you are the master, you control a great navy and are called an emperor. But I am a simple, man trying to feed his family, and I am called a pirate. And so St. Augustine said he thought that answer was very just and correct. And since I'm telling stories, and I'm a born storyteller, almost, I'd like to tell one about Elephant in the Dark. I wonder if you are familiar with this. It's a Rumi teaching story that I have changed slightly for modern consumption. But I think it explains a lot about the media and how it works or doesn't work. So there's this group of men in a room, and they're blindfolded, and they're in a room with an elephant, and they've never seen an elephant before and knew what it was. And they're asked to touch different parts of the elephant and to identify them. So it starts, the first one touches the tail and says, hey, well, that's a rope. Any idiot can feel that, see that. That's a rope, the tail. Then another one touches the tusk and says, well, clearly it's a spear. That's a no-brainer. Another one touches the ear and says, well, that with great confidence, well, that has to be a fan. Another one touches the leg and says that's a pillar, and on and on. And then the murshid, the seer, the wise man comes along and removes their blinds and says, look, it's an elephant. And so much of how we see the media and foreign policy and domestic policy is isolated, and so we need a systemic way to see the big picture. And that's why we need, an independent media. That's why we need, ricochet media, for example, and other efforts here in Canada. There's a new thing started actually by an Iranian-American, Pierre Omidyar, who's one of the founders of eBay. He started a new investigative journalism called The Intercept, featuring Glenn Greenwald, by the way. His latest book is right over there. And Laura Poitras, who won the Academy Award for the documentary Citizen 4 about Edward Snowden. There's a terrific Toronto journalist, Murtaza Hussain, who writes for The Intercept, and other, Jeremy Scahill. So it's an excellent source of independent information. You might know about my program, which you can hear on CFRO every Wednesday at noon. If you can't, there are free podcasts. You can go to the website. Building alternative media is an important political as well as psychological task, and I think something that we have to engage in, which is why I started alternative radio. Okay, so big deal. I had this critique of the media. This is like breaking news. The media sucks. Ooh. There's corporate control and concentration and media monopoly. Ooh. Wow, deep insight. So what are you going to do about it? So what do? Do you moan? Do you complain? It's terrible. There's nothing I can do about it. Hey, what are the Montreal Canadiens doing? Is Canada finally going to win the Stanley Cup? Hey, I understand it's a 22-year drought here. That's really serious. So am I going to do that or create an alternative? So I think for psychological reasons, it's really important to do what you can to engage in community and to resist, to fight back. So you feel at least some dignity, you have integrity to do that, and it's so very important. So I hope, I'm moving on tomorrow morning, but you're here, this is your community, this is your province, your country, do what you can here to change things and to try to extend the spectrum of social justice. So it's not just A to B, it's A to Z, so you encompass a much larger, a greater society that has more equality, that can diminish the stigma of racism and gender violence and all of these other very important social issues. So I think probably I could go on and on, but I want to tell you just a couple of other things. The big bargain here tonight. By the way, the Ricochet Media was unable to pay my $100,000 speaking fee. That's all I get, $100,000. See, if I were an American war criminal, like George Bush or Paul Wolfowitz or Dick Cheney, then I'd get $1 million plus a book contract also worth millions of dollars, and speaking in major colleges and universities. But I'm not a major war criminal. I'm just an independent media person. And so what I do is, as I go around, is have these books here and CDs, but the real bargain here is 4 CDs, brand new programs, my latest interview with Chomsky called It's in Your Hands. So this is actually something that relates exactly to what I just talked about. It's up to you. It's not waiting for some great guru to come along or some great pundit or ustad to say, hey, follow me, I'm your leader. No, you are the leaders. You are the Rosa Parks. You are the people who can make a difference. So that's a Chomsky interview. Chris Hedges, who's a terrific independent journalist and moral and Glenn Greenwald on why privacy matters. His book there. Actually, that book reads like a John le Carré novel. I read it, so not just because it's here, but it's so exciting. Meeting Snowden. First of all, they didn't even know who he was. They were worried that it was a trap, that the government was trying to, entrap them and then arrest them for, violating secrecy laws. So it's a very interesting kind of story. Another CD is Vandana Shiva of India, who has probably done more to alert people around the world about the dangers of GMOs. She is hated by Monsanto, who may have some enemies in Canada as well, Percy Schmeisser among them, of Saskatchewan? Saskatchewan, thank you. And she is also the one who's alerted us to over 300,000 farmer suicides in India because of the dumping of low-cost subsidized agriculture from the U.S. on the Indian market, driving Indians into debt, unable to pay their debt. Many of them have committed suicide. And she's a fabulous public speaker. I don't know. She was trained at the University of Western Ontario in London. A fabulous orator, just like gangbusters. And she's a trained nuclear physicist. That's her background. And she's become a full-time activist. So there are these 4 CDs, only 20 balloons, 20 clams. If you get them from Boulder, it would be 70. So that's a bargain. Make copies. There's some really good books here. The latest one with Chomsky, some other books, so Edward Said, etc. I want to close with a poem from Faiz Ahmed Faiz, the greatest Urdu poet of the 20th century from Pakistan. He was born in Sialkot in 1911. He died in Lahore in 1984. He was a journalist and proud of it. He was a trade unionist and proud of it. He was a communist and proud of it. And all over South Asia, he is venerated as the people's poet, as someone who expressed the desire for justice and for peace and equality. And he was, of course, anti-imperialist. And I live in Boulder, Colorado. There's a Naropa University there, and they feature poetry. They have a lot of poetry readings. If they get a crowd like this, they're just tickled pink for one of their poetry readings. They, wow, people in Boulder are so cool. They love poetry. They support the arts. Well, in India and Pakistan or Bangladesh, when there's a poetry reading, there are 70, 80, 90, 100,000 people turning out to hear poetry. And the poet says the first line, and the audience says the second line. They're that into it. So much, and this is true in Iran too, when Shamlu died a few years ago. Hundreds of thousands of people turned out in Tehran in the funeral procession. He was a very important contemporary Farsi poet in Farsi. So all over South Asia, you see during demonstrations and protests and sit-ins, the word bol, B-O-L. So this is the imperative in Hindi and Urdu to speak. Speak, that's all you have to do. Speak, don't be silent. And so you see these placards in Urdu and also in Hindi and other languages during any political activity. And everybody knows what it is, bol. So this is Faiz Ahmed Faiz, bol. Bol ke lab azad hai tere, bol zaban ab tak teri hai. Speak, your lips are free. Speak, your tongue is still yours. Speak, your life is still yours. Speak, there is little time, but little though it is enough time. Enough before the body perishes, before the tongue atrophies. Speak, the truth still lives. Say what you have to say. Speak, your lips are free. Bol, bol, bol.